How important is it to learn Chassidus? And what does Chassidus do for us? Why is Chassidus a more recent development of Judaism? So let's explore a well-known parable from the Frierdiker Rebbe about Chassidus, where he compares it both to coals and to pearls, that will give us an insight into appreciating the value and power of Chassidus. Once in a Sikh on Sukkot, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave a mashal al inyan Chassidus, parable, a double parable for Chassidus. This is what he said. If you want to find pearls, you look in the sea bed. And if you want to find coals, which have the capacity to generate both heat and light, those you have to mine because they're deep within the ground. Now, how do you get to them? The way is, you have to have somebody who is the guide as to where you should be prospecting. He's the person who will direct you. This is where you should dig, and this is where you're going to find the coals. And the workers who are actually going to do the physical labor can rely on the wisdom of the person who's directing them where they should be looking for the coals. But they can only successfully find the coals if they listen precisely to every detail that the supervisor gives them. And in spite of the fact that they're completely dependent on their supervisor, in order to live under the ground, work under the ground, you have to have oxygen which is coming from above ground. It goes without saying that they cannot rely on the fact that the supervisor above ground has oxygen. They obviously need oxygen of their own. Every worker independently has to have their own link to the oxygen, which is going to keep them alive from above ground. And if they don't, then the person could collapse. Meaning that the person will no longer have vitality. Likewise, if a person is deep diving in order to find pearls, he has to have a link to some kind of oxygen which comes from above ground. In the old days, the tubes that the divers used to have, and now we have self-sufficient scuba, but still the oxygen comes from above ground. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe concludes, everybody could interpret how the mashal applies to Chassidus. Chassidus me'ira u'mechamemes ki mashal hagicholim, because Chassidus illuminates and warms like coals do. But the reality is we've actually got to invest ourselves in the physicality of this world in order to refine and to achieve what Chassidus has to offer us. But in that process of engaging and refining the world, so the person obviously has to be connected to something which is outside of the picture, outside of the materialistic environment, and that's where a person is going to draw their vitality. Okay, so that's the mashal. It goes without saying that if the Frierdiker Rebbe is giving us a mashal, every single detail of that mashal is precise. And every single detail of the mashal is aligned with one of the messages of the nimshal. In which case, we have a few questions. Number one, why did the Frierdiker Rebbe need two different metaphors to describe what Chassidus is? On the one hand, the coals that you find within the bowels of the earth, and on the other hand, the pearls which are on the seabed. Why isn't one of them not good enough to illustrate the point? You've got to dig, you've got to be connected to a source of life, and you've got to be directed by somebody who knows what they're doing, and then you can find the value. Number two, even though the first thing that the Frierdiker Rebbe mentioned was the pearls, in a most of his attention in describing the mashal was about the coals. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe translated the mashal into a nimshal, he only spoke about the coals. Didn't mention the pearls at all. We have to wonder why that would be. And it would be a massive stretch to suggest because the Frierdiker Rebbe said that every person could understand the significance of the nimshal. It'd be a stretch to say, so the Frierdiker Rebbe assumed we would work out how the pearls are supposed to teach us about Chassidus. It doesn't make sense that he would have skipped out the details of the pearls, considering that he gave us the details of what the coals are supposed to represent in the mashal. When he explained about the coals, he explained it in a way that we could all relate to, not depending or relying on the fact that we'll be able to work it out. Which implies that it sounds like what the Friedrich Rebbe is saying is the most important information we need to have is that Chassidus is compared to coals, and of course we have to understand why would that be the primary representation of Chassidus. Number 3, anything that is quoted in Torah, which of course includes the words of the Rabbi, is absolutely precise. In which case we have to say the fact that coals are related to earth, and that pearls are related to the sea, it's not only because that's the physical reality, but because there's a thematic link between coals and earth and pearls and sea. In which case, we have to understand what is that connection? What is it about the earth that is so inherently linked to coals? And what is it about the ocean that is inherently linked to pearls? So let's start there. What is the difference conceptually between the earth and the ocean in spiritual terms? There are multiple places in Chassidus that explain this distinction. The easiest way for us to identify the difference between the symbolism of earth and sea is by looking at the creatures on earth and in the sea. We know that everything that is a land-based creature was created out of the earth. It's literally created out of the earth. And till today, we depend on the earth because that's what allows all the foodstuffs to grow in order to feed us. As the pasuk says, that bread comes out of the earth. Even though land-based creatures were created out of the soil, we don't see, once they're alive and on earth, we don't see an obvious link between those creatures and the soil. Whereas, when you look at sea creatures, dogim, for example, fish, separate them from their environment and their point of origin, which is the sea, and they die immediately. They can only survive inside the root, the origin from where they came. So therefore, the ocean becomes the metaphor for those realities where the divine energy, which brings them into existence and gives them life and keeps them existing, that vitality is absolutely clear and obvious. So anything that lives in that spiritual environment, which is comparable to the ocean, knows and appreciates at all times that it has to live within the consciousness of Elikus and part and parcel of Elikus in order to survive. Because should they disconnect, they are acutely aware that they'll disappear. That's why we call those the hidden words. What's hidden? In the same way as the fish are completely covered by the sea, so you stand at the beach, you can't even see the fish. In the same way, the personal identities of the entities that live in those higher spiritual worlds are completely concealed because they're enveloped in the reality of godliness. Now, our reality is completely different. Whereas any world or reality that is compared to earth, that is a reality where the beings do not have a constant consciousness and an obvious consciousness of the fact that the Eibishter is their life source. Which means they don't feel that bond between themselves and the source of their life. Which means that that's why we call these revealed worlds, because what is revealed? Their own identity is revealed. It's obvious. It's standalone. It feels independent. They feel that they are independent of their source of life, even though that is a false reality, but that's their sense. That helps us to understand the two aspects of the coal and the pearls in the moshel. The coals are in the earth, and the pearls are in the sea. The reason for that is because the impact that Chassidus has on a person is primarily in two ways. There's an impact of Chassidus on the conscious element of the human being, which is the so-called land-based part of the person where I feel like me. And Chassidus also impacts the part of me that is hidden, the deeper part of myself, which is like the sea, that is completely encompassed in godliness, and we'll explain how that is. And in order to understand these two things, we'll have to ask the key question, why is Chassidus a recent development? So let's ask the question, why was Chassidus specifically revealed in more recent generations? Because you could ask, since when does our generation deserve such a fantastic revelation of godliness? And there are two explanations that we're going to focus on, key explanations. Well, it's because of how bad things are, and because we're at a very low state of galus where there's a tremendous amount of darkness. We need the impetus of a tremendously powerful spiritual holy light to be able to overcome such a thick darkness. For which reason, they wish to reveal to us the soul of Torah, because that will awaken our deep buried power of our own neshama, which has the capacity to overcome the challenges of this world. So, why do we have Chassidus? Because the world is in so much trouble, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are really at the end of Golus, which means we now have to prepare to greet Moshiach, to be in the state of Geula. And whatever you're preparing for, you obviously have to prepare in a way that is suitable to what you're preparing for. Therefore, the gave us a taste of what we can anticipate is going to happen in the time of Moshiach. Like the Arizal says, and this is actually brought in halacha, including in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and Kislev is a celebration of his Geula. Then on Friday you're supposed to taste some of the Shabbos food. As the pasuk says, those who taste, who sample, they'll have life. So in the same way as we taste the Shabbos food on Friday, we're supposed to taste the Mashiach experience, because Mashiach is the time of Shabbos, on the time Erev Shabbos, when we're very close to the Gilui of Mashiach. So these are the two explanations, and there's a distinction between them. One of the differences between these two explanations is this. The first explanation says, why do we have Chassidus? To give us the power to overcome Golus. That is speaking the language of the conscious state of the human being. Because that's a part of me that's fighting the friction of Golus. And it's with those conscious capacities that I'm able to overcome the impulses of the body and the interests of the nefesh habamis, etc. So when you plug Chassidus into the koichas hagluyim, then that empowers these koichas hagluyim, because we're now drawing on the depths of the neshama to be able to overcome the darkness. Even the most incredibly thick, dense darkness of the time in which we're living, the end of history. Whereas the second opinion is explanation is a completely different perspective. Chassidus is a taste of what's coming. Well, in that case, that tells me then Chassidus is not there to protect me from the overwhelming darkness that exists, because there will be no darkness at the time of Mashiach. In the time of Mashiach, there'll just be absolute unity with everything and everyone, and the Eibishter. Which aligns with the fact that this process of refining the world in order to extract holiness, which is a primary focus now, will not even exist when Mashiach comes. Because the Eibishter is going to completely remove any impurities from the world. The only thing that will happen in the time of Mashiach is constant elevation and progression in terms of our spiritual development. That speaks the language of the depth of the neshama as it is, not the depth of the neshama as an aid to the conscious side of myself in order to be able to impact the world. This is speaking to my neshama in its pristine sense. Because at that level of soul, I'm absolutely one with the Eibishter, as we say. So let's go back to the first explanation for Chassidus. It's to empower us to be able to overcome the darkness. That is a critical element of being able to serve the Eibishter. If we can't overcome the darkness of Golus, how can we serve the Eibishter? So we have to have this capacity of Chassidus. Or as the Friedrich Rebbe said in the Mashal, we don't want to land up in a situation where we fall without lifeblood. Well, that dimension of Chassidus is compared to coal, which provides light and warmth, because those are essentials of human survival, and this is a part of Chassidus that is essential to spiritual survival. Whereas when Chassidus speaks to the depths and essence of my neshama in its own language, meaning to say, speaking to the neshama as a neshama which is one with the Eibishter, that's nimshal margolius. That's the part of Chassidus that is compared to pearls. Because that's not essential for survival during golus. It's kind of a bonus. It's like pearls that add value to the person, that the person now looks fancy. So this adds value to our experience, but it's not essential for our survival. Which explains why why most of what the Friedrich Rebbe spoke about described the coals, because they're essential to our survival. Because first and foremost, we need the part of Chassidus that is going to empower us to be able to survive and thrive during the golus before we get to the add-ons, the embellishment of having pearls as well. Okay, that's the general picture. Now let's understand it in greater detail. When describing Chassidus as coals, the Friedrich Rebbe pointed out two things. That coals generate both light and warmth. The common denominator between light and warmth is that neither of them changes the environment. Warmth is a symbol of life. V'oir and light, which obviously illuminates, don't add further details to the environment. The environment is as it is. But the impact of the coals is that what was originally there is now alive. So in other words, all the pieces of the puzzle were there, but it wasn't necessarily switched on. And it's illuminated, so we're sitting in the dark, and now you can see exactly what's what. Which is exactly what happens with Chassidus. Chassidus didn't come to add new perspectives or angles within Torah. Because Torah cannot have any changes, whether that's to chas v'shalom remove something from Torah or even add something to Torah. Even before there was Chassidus, people fulfilled all of the mitzvahs, and they did so perfectly. So what does Chassidus do? But we're now living in a world that is spiritually cold and dark. And it's an extreme freeze and an extreme darkness. So therefore we need now, we need the mitzvahs to be infused with warmth and with illumination, because that is absent in the world. You can get people going through the motions, doing all of the things that the Torah requires, without that vitality and without that light. Chassidus helps to bring it to life and to bring it to light. Which addresses the question of people saying, we have our traditions. The person complains or argues, listen, my grandfather, who was around before there was Chassidus, he was okay. He wasn't missing something because he wasn't learning Chassidus. But the person who's making this claim surely recognizes that his grandfather was much more alive in his Judaism and had much more of an illuminated Judaism, including his whole generation, which is why we ask the question about our generation, if we're suitable to do what the Eibishter wants, or to have this revelation of Chassidus. And it's like the person who's trying to bring a proof from one scenario to make a decision about another scenario. Just like in the middle of the heat of summer, you don't have to light the fire and close all the doors. Can you imagine somebody suggesting, well, you know what, in that case, that's how I should always do. I should never light fires and I should never close my doors. Even in the middle of winter, we all recognize that would be ridiculous. So there was a time in history where Judaism and Jewish people were much more alive and warm and illuminated. That's not the case, and that's why we need Chassidus now. What Chassidus did for us, or does for us, is it reveals the depths of our own neshama. And therefore, that injected new life, vitality, and new light into all of our Torah mitzvahs. That's one of the key emphases of Chassidus, which is that the way that we serve the Eibishter has to be with energy and with joy. As well as the fact that Chassidus alerts us to the tremendous danger of not being energetic. The danger of cold, which implies lack of life, God forbid. But the reality is that even when a person is serving the Eibishter with chayas, with energy, with enthusiasm, that could also still be limited to the person's nature. Like anything that's living, obviously if it's living, it means that it has life. In fact, you have a look, many animals in the animal kingdom seem to have greater vitality than humans. They can run faster, they're stronger than us, etc. But what is unique about the animal kingdom is that the energy and vitality of an animal is limited to the nature of that animal. There isn't an animal that is capable of self-generating to be able to do something which is different to its nature. What's great about us and what elevates us above all other creatures is not only that we are warm and alive, we're warm-blooded, and that we maybe even have more warmth and enthusiasm than the next guy, but we also have the capacity to illuminate. Animals don't. We have the capacity to be able to see with our wisdom, the wisdom of seeing that which is above our heads, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. Which means we're not locked into just seeing what I like and what people around me like and what happens to be trendy at the moment, but rather to be focused on how things should be. And then to go ahead and actually do these things, even if they're not my nature, and even to do things which are opposite to our nature. Animals cannot do that. That's the uniqueness of humans, specifically Jewish people. Okay, this is a big Gemara. As the Gemara says, it's possible for a person to be absolutely scrupulous about fulfilling all the positive and avoiding all the negative mitzvahs, and to do so with enthusiasm, and still be called somebody who's not yet serving the Eibishter, because the person hasn't ever challenged themselves to go against their nature. And the key of all growth and development is to fight against what comes naturally. To be considered as somebody who is doing the Eibishter's will, the person has to be able to push themselves with all of their might, meaning ma'oid, to the extreme, beyond what is natural. To go beyond the structure and nature of the person's makeup, and the only way to achieve that is with having this light in your life. And that's what Chassidus gives us. Because both life, vitality, enthusiasm, and light, insight, and clarity are deeper aspects of how we serve the Eibishter. So you need somebody like the miner who's looking for the coal needs a supervisor above ground who's going to tell him where to look and how to look. We also need to know how to find the within ourselves. It's not something that we can just work out on our own. So who are the guides? Those are our Rabbeim. They give us the instructions, they clarify for us the way that we're supposed to serve the Eibishter, and together they also empower us to be able to succeed. How we can illuminate and warm ourselves in our environment. And the Friedrich says in the Marshal that the miners can completely rely on the supervisor. As long as they are willing to listen to his instructions very, very specifically, not to shift or add, but stay exactly in line with what the supervisor tells them. And then the Friedrich adds another aspect, which is yes, you can be guided and you can be instructed by the person who knows the geology of the environment, but you have to have your own connection to oxygen. There you can't rely on the fact that the supervisor has oxygen. Each worker independently has to be connected to a source of air. What does that mean? A person could think, because I'm relying on the wisdom of the Rebbe, who is my guide, and I'll then have to listen so precisely to every single thing that he says. So you know what? I'm just going to surrender. Whatever I'm told to do, that's what I'm going to do. And the Rebbe gives an example. Somebody once claimed, it would appear to the Rebbe, he wants a direct instruction, Aleph to Tov, of exactly what he should be doing. And he'll accept and listen to everything, because he's willing to surrender his entire interests in favor of what the Rebbe wants from him. But to have to innovate, to have to think, to have to strategize, he doesn't want to have to do any of that. That's the wrong approach. And therefore you have the instruction from the Frierdiker Rebbe that together with the fact that a person is supposed to surrender their interests in favor of what the Rebbe tells him, which is what the Eibishter wants. But the human also has to be a fully developed human. The human has to use their intellect. They have to develop an emotional attachment with what they're doing. And they have to translate it into action. But that entire structure has to be completely anchored in what it is that the supervisor, the Rebbe, is telling us to do, not obviously to invent our own ideas. That's what the Frierdiker Rebbe says in the Sikha. When it comes to the Ruach Chaim, to the actual oxygen, it's not good enough to say, I am plugged into a Rebbe who is alive and well. Different to the other approaches of perhaps other groups who say, well, the tzaddik is the one who's going to infuse us all with life, where it says that a tzaddik lives with his emunah and they revow it as yichayeh. He gives life through his emunah. In other words, you believe in the tzaddik and you're alive. To depend on the tzaddik to keep us alive. And that's the message. Each one of us has to have our own independent drive. To put it very simply, how does a person provide themselves with oxygen? Every single day, we have to have a fixed time that we learn Chassidus. Not just superficially, okay, I learned some Chassidus. But we have to completely invest ourselves to toil in understanding Chassidus to the point that you actually feel that there was exertion in this Chassidus. And that type of investment in Chassidus has to happen daily. There is no chassid on earth who could say, I'm good, I am overflowing with chassidus, I know so many mamorim by heart. It's not even good enough to say, well, yesterday I exerted myself over my chassidus. Our responsibility is to re-engage and re-immerse daily, because if we're dealing with oxygen can never have a break. Look at human survival. Let's say a person had a ridiculous suggestion, I'd like to live on Sunday and Tuesday. But Monday, I want to take off. I don't want to have to engage with life. Any logical person can understand, you skip Monday, you don't get to Tuesday. And it's exactly the same with Chassidus. If we're not invested daily in learning Chassidus properly, we're disconnecting from life. We don't have the Ruach HaChaim. And therefore, primarily, a person has to remember, we're not talking theory here, we're talking practice. And we're talking to each individual. And we're not talking about to the person as they were yesterday. We're addressing the person as the person woke up this morning with a fresh neshama. Which means the person has to, once again, from the bottom up, reconnect to their spiritual oxygen. And the way you do that is by a set time to learn Chassidus, with new vigor or new enthusiasm. As if it was a person who had never learned Chassidus ever before in their life. And then the person will have the light and the warmth that they need properly to illuminate their life. Everything that we have described so far, they're bringing the light and bringing the warmth of Chassidus, which we have to do by learning every single day and being directed, obviously, by the Rabbeim. That is the kols element of Chassidus. Hakosha lebechinas adama, which speaks to the part of ourselves, that is the lower part of ourselves, where we feel a conscious sense of self. Galia sheba'adam, the revealed human. Yes, to access gecholim, it's in the depths of the grounds, which implies that I have to dig deep within myself. But even if I'm digging deep within myself, I'm still digging deep within myself. Which means, therefore it's possible that a person could really invest in all of this and still feel, I did this, I achieved, I succeeded. The person will be serving the Eibusha with tremendous enthusiasm. And not only that, but the person will be moving themselves and doing things which are contrary to their nature, extending themselves beyond their natural limitations. But there'll be this constant awareness, I am the one who's serving the Eibusha. Look at me, I'm amazing. The person's self is very consciously revealed. It is me who's serving Hashem with this great enthusiasm, including this incredible enthusiasm that is beyond myself. Well, I have gone beyond myself. And therefore there is an even higher, more advanced experience of Chassidus, which is to touch and activate the part of the neshama that is completely hidden. This is where the person becomes completely enveloped to the extent of like the highest level of the mocker of where I come from completely envelops me, which means belikus. I'm completely immersed in godliness. Where I don't feel self at all. How do you get there? The only way to achieve this is through learning Chassidus, which is the well springs of Torah. The part of Torah where godliness shines through very openly and obviously. We know in many places we've discussed the possibility that when a person is only learning Nigla of Torah, they could land up learning Torah in a way that where they don't say the bracha in advance, which is Birchas Noisin HaTorah Afalpi Shechavivas HaTorah Yeshna. So they're not reminding themselves that the Torah comes directly from the Eibishter, even though they are completely cherishing and valuing the Torah. Which means that it is possible for a person to learn Torah and forget about the one who gave the Torah. Because that could never happen in Chassidus, because the learning of Chassidus sensitizes you to be able to feel elikus. Even though we'll never lose free choice, and therefore it's possible for a person to actually activate the Yetzer Hara in such a way that they could even learn Chassidus in an inappropriate fashion. That is possible. But when a person learns Chassidus in abundance, the person becomes overwhelmed and covered and encompassed in godliness, which is a taste of Mashiach's times, where the entire reality will be completely encompassed and immersed in godliness. So this is not something that you've got to do differently. So like, for example, we're not learning Chassidus in order to behave differently. And you find even in Nigla de Torah that there's a type of learning of Nigla de Torah which is not associated with what you're going to do differently. This is what we say when you learn Torah, just simply in order to elevate the status of Torah. Where you're learning something that doesn't have a practical relevance, but you're learning Torah just simply because that's what the Eibishter wants, and the Eibishter will acknowledge and reward you for having done so. So this part of Torah, where we're engaging with Chassidus in a way that it speaks to the essence of our neshama, and we are completely covered in elikus and enveloped in elikus, that is not something which is relevant necessarily to practice. That's what's compared to pearls, which you could survive without. A person could live an entire lifetime without pearls and they'll be fine. But when can you say that pearls are not necessary? That's when you're in your own environment. But if the person has to present themselves in front of the king, not the king during Elul making himself accessible to the public, but you're going into the most intimate sanctum of the king to be able to face the king in his throne room. Then it's not good enough just to have all my clothes are intact, even if I'm wearing some fancy brand name suit. And I mean, if I'm going to the king, I have to have some type of jewelry, pearls. In the way that is appropriate for somebody who's going to present themselves in front of the king. If a person misses those pearls, not only is there a little bit of the uniform that he's missing, this is an insult to the king. You come to the king without all the special trappings that you're supposed to wear. And that has direct relevance to the nimshal of Chassidus. When a person learns Chassidus, as we've described, the deeper dimension of Chassidus for its own sake, not just to empower us to be able to overcome the darkness of the world. In order that we should know and understand the Eibishter. So in earlier generations, maybe that wasn't absolutely essential. Because if they hadn't yet reached the stage of the final preparations for Mashiach, they didn't have to wear the pearls. Like the person is not yet going to see the king, you don't have to have the pearls. But that's not where we are. We're living in a time where Mashiach is just behind the wall. Mashiach is coming. And when Mashiach comes, that's the end of darkness. And then we'll have the true, permanent Geula. The Geula is compared to the wedding bond between us and the Eibishter. And it's at that time that we'll be able to reveal that we and the Eibishter are one, like in marriage, when two people become a single flesh. As we say in Shmini Atzeres, that it's like the king and the Yidden alone, and everybody else is out of the environment. You have to prepare appropriately. You have to have the kind of jewelry that you'd wear to the chuppah, the chuppah of the King of all Kings. Therefore, we have a requirement to learn Chassidus in absolute abundance. And so, and that is a response to people who complain, you acknowledge Chassidus it's a beautiful thing. In fact, it's like pearls. But the person says, I'm a humble person, I'm a simple Jew, I don't need all these fancy things like pearls. I'm happy, my clothes are clean, my clothes are intact, my thought, speech, and action is directed to what the Eibishter wants. I'm doing mitzvahs, that's it. And I even have some adornments as well. But I'm okay without the pearls. So that person has to know. First and foremost, there's a halacha clearly in Shulchan Aruch that every Jew is required to learn the esoteric part of Torah like you're required to learn every other part of Torah. But besides that, you want your clothing to be clean. You want your machshava to be aligned with what the Eibishter wants. In such a dark time as Golus, you need Chassidus. Without it, unfortunately, that's not an option. But besides that, but to have the luxury of saying, I don't need pearls, that is in a bygone time. But now that we're so close to Mashiach, we have to be ready that right now we could walk into the chuppah with the Eibishter. How then is it possible that you could have a person who's not chasing after pearls? Because what, you don't want to be ready to come into the Eibishter's embrace? Yes, the Zohar tells us. The Zohar says that during the Golos, the Jewish people are compared to a bride, but the bride is in a tanner shop where it smells of leather, which is not a pleasant experience. And with and because he loves his bride so much, the Chassan, which is the Eibishter, is willing to overcome or to ignore the terrible smell of the tannery, and go find the color where she is. So, why do I have to go get the jewels? The Eibishter is coming to find me. The Zohar says that's how things are during Golus. But ato yigeh ha'eshia daloi golus, keitzla golus, it's enough golus already. And therefore we now have to be like the Jews when they were about to leave Mitzrayim, but were still in Mitzrayim. They all had light in their environment. We have to be ready to welcome the Geula. So how can I possibly suggest I'm ready for the chuppah if I'm still wearing the clothes that I had inside the tannery? The appropriate way to prepare ourselves as a bride for the Eibishter's chuppah is with a whole lot of jewelry. We have to flood the world with Chassidus. Like the pasuk says, that the ocean it covers the seabed. And by us doing that, by flooding the world with Chassidus, that really prepares us to be able to stand at that chuppah together with the Eibishter. And then we'll be able to see with our own physical eyes, in a real tangible way, that the Yidden and the Eibishter are one. We're in an intimate embrace with the Eibishter to the exclusion of all others. That should happen immediately.